opposed to any watering down of the RDA is the Jewish community. Joining me now, Colin Rubenstein, Executive Director of the Australian Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Colin Rubenstein, welcome to the studio. Now, let's go first to those remarks of Corey Bernardi this morning that the government needs to change or get rid of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. That is the section which says that people cannot insult and offend people on the basis of race and various other beliefs, for example. Reconnect with the base. What's your response to that?
Well, to humiliate and intimidate as well. My response is that this is misconceived, and if anything's likely to divorce the Liberals from their base, it's moving in this direction, because after all, modern Australian liberalism has been one of the main architects of the very successful model of Australian multiculturalism. And when we think of the leadership of Malcolm Fraser and his advisors like Petro Georgiou, going through successive prime ministers right up to Tony Abbott and certainly Malcolm Turnbull, think of state leaders Jeff Kennett, Ted Baillieu and Barry O'Farrell and Mike Baird. This is a bipartisan policy of commitment to Australian multiculturalism, and I would argue that the Racial Hatred Act and 18C in particular, and with it the far-ranging exemptions of 18D, which the critics never refer to, have been a very important pillar of developing and maintaining decent Australian life, our harmony amidst a sea of great diversity. It's been an important contribution to containing and fighting racism, because it's based on the importance of giving Australians the right to defend themselves from racist harassment and vilification, which didn't exist before.
Now, the coalition, as you noted by remarking on a number of its leaders over the years, has worked very hard to connect with the Jewish community. What impact do you think it would have on the view of the coalition within the Jewish community were Section 18C to be abolished as a consequence of the move being led by Corey Bernardi?
Well, I think I can speak more broadly of multicultural Australia, having been heavily involved in the evolution of Australian multiculturalism, because we saw it last time around when the Liberals went to the previous election with a policy to review and revise, and they tried to do that. And there was wall-to-wall reaction, revulsion, rejection from Australian multiculturalism, because simply this is misconceived. Because the real issue there, people talk about freedom of speech being at risk, but that's a gross exaggeration, and there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech. What really is at issue here is whether Australians are entitled to be protected from vilification and harassment. Is there a freedom to actually vilify and harass other Australians? That's what the real issue is here. And I think not just multicultural Australia, but right across Australian society, there is an understanding that you can't vilify and harass people, because it has a diabolical effect on the quality of life of Australians, psychologically, anxiety, frustration, anger, withdrawal. And of course, words are bullets. They can be the precursor to violent action. And people forget the origins of this legislation. There's an inquiry, a national inquiry into racist violence in the early 90s, which demonstrated no matter how good our record is, and we are one of the most tolerant and welcoming societies on the planet, but nonetheless we can be better. There's still racism here, and this act was designed, and this section in particular was designed to protect groups from group defamation, from claims that they're enemies of the Australian public, corrupt, immoral, and we see those slanders and that group defamation from time to time. And my basic point would be this is precisely the wrong time for the Liberals or anybody else, and the Labor Party obviously seems to get it, to be thinking of diluting, let alone rejecting, which clearly is what is the main agenda of some of the protagonists here, of 18C and protections of racial hatred, because we've seen the resurgence of extremism, of populism, of One Nation in Australia and other extreme populist groups here and internationally. So, you know, symbolically, this legislation gives a guideline as to what's acceptable or not, what's not acceptable in Australia. And we're talking about very limited sort of provisions. These are civil provisions, and of course the main recourse is through arbitration and conciliation. And of course the record is that very few cases actually get into a court.
Have you made, or you or any other Jewish leader made this clear directly to Malcolm Turnbull? And if so, what response did you get?
Well, we have repeatedly over the years. We fought with others in Australian society, wall to wall, to expose the weaknesses and the flaws and the inconsistencies in the previous efforts to amend, dilute or even reject 18C and the racial hatred provisions. And what we got, of course, is, and this burnt up a lot of the oxygen and support for the Abbott government in the first place, let's not forget. So revisiting that same approach, I think, you know, is not learning from previous experience. I think we have a lot of sympathy, I think, from Prime Minister Turnbull and his colleagues, because his cabinet wall-to-wall is saying the deal is done. I think it's not just it's not a priority, it's not on the agenda because it's totally counterproductive to the maintenance and development of harmonious Australia. It's a counterproductive exercise that these people are engaged in. And of course, they ignore completely all the positive achievements of this Racial Hatred Act. From our community's point of view, of course, there have been cases that have been won on Holocaust denial, the Tobin case, of distributing, you know, vile anti-Semitic literature in Tasmania, the Scully case. There have been cases won protecting Indigenous Australians from violent abuse from neighbours, calling them murderers, and so on and so forth. We have, I mean, very few cases actually have gone to court, but those that have produced very important results. And I think we underestimate the significance of the conciliation process. Overall, nothing's perfect, of course. All legislation can be reviewed from time to time, and no one would have any objection to that. Abuses occasionally occur, but does that undermine the validity and the merits and the contribution of this law? I do not think so.
Just to get this quite clear, are you suggesting that were the coalition to proceed with this legislation, or part of the coalition, that it would cost the coalition votes?
Look, I think if we went down the path of trying to dilute this legislation, and as the Libertarians want to throw it out altogether, I think it would be popular, would be electorally extremely unpopular, right across mainstream elements of Australian society.
Now, you just said a moment ago that no legislation is perfect, and the one case that the proponents of getting rid of 18C always point to is the instance of the students from QUT and the action taken there when they were denied, after they were denied access to a space reserved for Indigenous students, and some comments that they made on social media. This has been going on for 3 years. There's still a potential cost of $250,000 hanging over the heads of at least one of these students. As you yourself have acknowledged publicly, this has not been managed well, has it? This does suggest, does it not, that there is a need at least to look at the administration of the Act, if not at the Act itself?
Look, we simply don't know enough about this case, despite the intense and constructive reporting we've seen in some of the Australian media. Indeed, you know, justice delayed is justice denied. So one would hope that cases like this would be expedited and dealt with much earlier. So prima facie, it certainly doesn't look good. One feels for all the parties involved in that case, because they're obviously there's great concerns on both sides of this case, and one would like it to be expedited. And yes, in terms of the administration of the law, who would argue against looking at it in more detail? But we simply don't know enough about this case, and to hang a whole campaign around one case seems to me to be logically, you know, quite untenable and unconvincing.
Look, I'm just wondering about this in terms of racial vilification. The celebrated instance quite recently where the Adelaide Crows footballer, Eddie Betts, Indigenous footballer, had a banana thrown at him, and the immediate response from the Port Adelaide Football Club was to terminate the membership of the woman involved. And Eddie Betts turned around and said, no, 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 don't do that. She has apologised. She deserves a second chance. She should be in a position to learn. Isn't that the way we should be going, rather than putting stuff into legislation which means that it goes before the courts? Isn't this a much more satisfactory way of dealing with these sorts of crimes and misdemeanours in 21st century multicultural Australia?
Well, these approaches are not mutually exclusive. And of course, the AFL have been leaders in promoting Australian multiculturalism and Indigenous rights, and they deserve great plaudits for the leadership that they've absolutely shown. But I'm afraid not everybody is Eddie Betts on an AFL football field. The cases we're talking about are much more remote. You don't have the same accessibility to the media or public attention, and we're talking about very many real cases where Australians, ordinary Australians, are victims of bullying and harassment and vilification and have no other recourse, did not have any other recourse really, unless the media happened to pick up the case or unless they happen to be a champion footballer. This legislation provides them with that recourse and provides broader ethnic communities with that recourse, which they never had before, because under defamation law, of course, this only applies to individuals. So this law has plugged an important hole. It's not the sole way of fighting racism, but it's proven to be a very constructive way, and any suggestion of diluting it or even throwing it out, I think, would be a very regressive move, and I think politically unpopular right across Australia.
Colin Rubenstein, thank you very much indeed. Colin Rubenstein from the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Now let's go back to Hangzhou in China and political editor David Spears. David, we were